starting from the transcendent concept of liminality, or like the attitude towards story that I call liminality, now we can think about the next step, the infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure can embody that notion of liminality, where the primary user of that protocol is actually the story and not the person? The users, like us, we are more like the vehicle that holds space for the actual users, which are the stories. Sandtalk was very inspiring for that. What you see here on screen, the word logos has a lot of meanings, but here I'm using it as pointing to our dynamic relationship to story. So the way we interact with them and they interact with us. If you go back in time, the original way we did that, people gathered at campfires. Everybody brought their own pieces, their own stories that they held space for. And then in the context of the campfire, these stories would self-organize into more coherent, higher order stories. You passively hold space for these beings to do what they cannot not do if they encounter each other without resistance. Tyson would call that yarning. Don't speak unless spoken through. What you see down here is representing what he calls sand talk. Instead of just holding space for the story and letting it speak through you, you can also draw a symbol in the sand and infuse the meaning of the story into that symbol. So yarning and sand talk are basically two distinct modalities, but they belong together. We have the monologos, which is the sand talk, the dialogos, landing like from Viveki, and that concept, which is the yarning, like the warm context, where monologos is kind of like the cold, frozen version of the story. And if these two exist, then using the immanent metaphysics, we can see that there should be an immanent modality, which I refer to as the interlogos. The interlogos is kind of like the dynamic interplay of the monologos and the dialogos, how people find each other in the dialogos, mediated by which monologos they have encountered, and all of that stuff. This is like a very fundamental trinity on which the infrastructure of the project is built.
The omniscient, which in this case would mean something like it orients us towards a domain. If we're in the context of we're all sort of attuning to a particular monologos, that provides a context, a domain, orientation that allows us to say, okay, yes, this is kind of the what that we're engaging in, which in the space of dialogos then opens up the field of play inside that domain.
A symbol doesn't have meaning on its own. It's kind of like the culture that infuses it into, and it stabilizing functions. You can cohere around that symbol means that in our context. How the monologos enables the dialogos, I will get to that, because there's like a quite specific way I think it should work. Liminal space is where this whole thing is leading to. The monologos, the dialogos, and the interlogos are again a trinity. The monologos is kind of how the logos looks from the outside, and the dialogos is how it feels from the inside. So cold and warm is the language that I also like to use. What is the right relationship between monologos and dialogos? If you look at the internet today, it's almost pure monologos. The monologos has kind of, instead of being in service to the dialogos, it has kind of eaten away that substrate, debasing its own substrate, because everybody is looking at screens instead of at each other's faces, and we've distracted away from the dialogos by the monologos, and you get doom scrolling and all of that information overwhelmed, because it's not like what we're doing right now. I cannot be overwhelmed really, because we are both in tune with the rhythm of the conversation. But if you just have monologos, you're totally detached from any external rhythm, and then you can just totally be overwhelmed. The interlogos is basically answering the question of how should they relate, these two modalities. Just as for the superstructure, the punchline was kind of like a story as a being. For the infrastructure, for the liminal space, the idea is a story is a place, which is also an indigenous notion. In the context of the digital, we can actually do that. We can actually turn a story into a place, because we have a subreddit, for example, about a story, right? People can meet there. Project Liminality is basically a communication protocol that can be plugged into apps like a module. In this protocol, you have these nodes, monologos nodes. Each node can hold a story. What you can see here can be reinterpreted as a poor man's version of how the project could look like. All these pictures that I'm opening, each of that could be a monologos node. You basically have something you could call like a liminal wallet, where you hold all the stories that you carry. The project can be thought of like building a digital twin of the logos. Everything that exists in the organic context, we try to mirror that into or project that into the digital plane. Obviously, then we can do interesting new things with it. If you frame a human as something like a vehicle holding space for stories, the idea is that you can now have monologos nodes that hold these stories. Your liminal wallet is basically just a digital twin of your interior. So if I hold a story, what I just opened here, that is kind of a story, I can put that on what I call digital sand, in a sense. Like when we're having this conversation, I can just, instead of like in the physical world drawing something in the sand, I can just put that on the digital sand. If that thing would already exist, then you would also have your own monologos nodes, and we would have a shared sand. If we have a conversation and some story comes up, I can just take that story and show it to you, put it on the digital sand, and then you would also hold that story, because that's exactly how it works in the organic domain. We're basically just trying to reconnect to how nature does it, and in a sense, redo the internet on the Dialogos spaces instead of the monologos spaces.
At the level of intellect, at the level of thinking about it, it makes very good sense. And if I kind of think about the way that I would orient all these different notions that you're putting out there, the regalia of the story that is expressing itself through you allures my sense-making orientation. It says, that's a very important story. Pay attention to it and find ways to be of service to bringing it more fully into the world.